All right. So again, welcome to Open Education Week on Tuesday afternoon with us. We're glad that you're here, whether you're in person or watching the recording. We just appreciate your participation. I want to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Peter Brusoe, is an assistant professor of economics and political science at SUNY Delhi. Peter earned his PhD in political science from American University in Washington, D.C., and his master's degree from Albany's Nelson A. Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. And he graduated summa cum laude from the University at Albany with a bachelor's degree in political science and history. Before teaching at Delhi, Peter worked for 10 and a half years for Bloomberg government as a campaign finance, lobbying, and legislative data analyst. He was also an adjunct professor for both American University and the University of the District of Columbia. Peter's research focuses on the intersection of money, lobbying, and public policy choices. And he's also done research on the impact of technology on learning outcomes. So welcome, Peter. We're interested in what you have to share today.
So thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you and SUNY for organizing this. It is so important that we do this to be able to make more educational resources available. Today we're going to talk about a project I do with my students called Federalist Papers Meets AI for Artificial Intelligence, and sort of go through and talk about kind of how we do the project and the learning outcomes we achieve for our students. We're going to start out, all students struggling mightily with philosophy. A couple of these different combinations of students sometimes have weak reading skills. We're still recovering from the impact of the pandemic, where there's a lot of online learning and some of the basic skills just weren't there. Concepts are often very difficult to understand. A lot of the philosophy that we read is from the 18th century, and so they have people talk. The words, the voice, the vocabulary is very specialized and very particularly for that time period. When we do philosophy in any of our classes, it requires a lot of faculty time and understanding. When our larger institutions requires a lot of use of teaching assistants or other kinds of tutors to get them through that. The one universal thing in all of higher education these days is the lack of funding and resources. And so I do base a lot of my American government classes rooted in the philosophy of Locke and then using the Federalist Papers and anti-Federalist Papers to think about the philosophy of American government. And so one of the ways we do this is, of course, pricey textbooks. And there are pricey textbooks that I feel they offer some value, but that value pales into what the students are paying for. And so we constantly hear from students how expensive the textbooks are. Often there's not enough aid to be able to cover them, and students struggle to find the resources that they need. A lot of times we have students who go through, they buy secondary market books. And so if we're reading, say, Locke, Second Treatise, the page numbers are different, right? So if a student is struggling, I'm like, turn to page 10, they don't have that, right? So it makes it much harder for them to be able to learn together, to keep together. There's also sometimes variations on translations and notes. And so when they try to get around the cost of it, like doing the secondary market, it just doesn't work out quite so well. Luckily, we have the Avalon Project. So this was started way back in 1996, last century. And so the Lillian Goldman Law Library at Yale Law School, they decided it would be important for us to provide historic documents of interest, particularly related to public policy, related to politics, in a readily accessible format. And essentially, since 1996, that mission has continued, including a lot of our founding documents. If you haven't explored the Avalon Project, you should. It's I love it for so many reasons. One, it's very easy to organize. It's text-based. We have students with visual impairments. They can easily go through and be able to Zoom or use a Zoom, like Zoom in, not Zoom, the video meeting share platform. Also be able to use enhancers, be able to get it. We're able to switch contrast. So the Avalon Project is very, very adaptable and very easy to use. It also means we're all using the same version of this. And so for those who are maybe not familiar with what are the Federalist Papers, 1787, the founders of our country gathered in Philadelphia. After the failure of the Articles of Confederation, they decide that rather than amending it, they want to create a brand new constitution. One of the things that the founders did is underneath the Articles, they had to have unanimity among the 13 states. And it was almost difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. And they were like, if we do it this way, we will never get this constitution ratified. So what they wound up doing is they created these ratification conventions. And once 9 of the 13 states agreed to it, that would make it the new constitution and be able to make a new way of governing. And I like to tell my students, as you think about the 13 colonies, one colony is filled with skeptical people who like to argue. Of course, we're talking about New Yorkers. And so New Yorkers are very concerned about the new Constitution. And so rather than using social media, using Twitter, the stuff that we argue with now, they took it to the newspapers. And so they wrote a total of 85 of them, all using pseudonyms. Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of those essays. James Madison wrote 29 of them, and John Jay wrote 5. John Jay was going to write a lot more. Unfortunately, he got sick during it. But this laid out the philosophy of the Constitutional Convention. It laid out the theories and ideas. Um, excuse me, sorry. And it laid out the idea of this is why we should have the new government. These are all the reasons for it. And so it often be read in taverns and other establishments to share these kinds of ideas. There were two types of newspapers in each community, and so they're often published one point of view versus the other point of view. But these 85 documents provide for us the founding philosophy of the Second American Republic, how the Constitution works. And so on the screen, this is the way that the Avalon Project has it. It says the Federalist Papers. There's different boxes with each one. So you click on number 1 to get Federalist number 1, number 2, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I love, this is done in a matrix format for those who may not be able to see it, and it allows them to easily go through, be able to click on that, and it's the same translation, it's the same area, so students can access it via their laptop, they can access it via their phones. In a few cases, we do have students that request we print them out. So using our faculty printing, we will print out a few of them to be able to read, so they have access to that. Again, it's all the same translations. In opposition to that, we have the anti-federalist papers. What was interesting is the opposition to the new centralized government was themselves not organized. So again, writing in pseudonyms, we had Brutus, about 16 essays. We believe that was Robert Yates. We have the Federalist Farmer, which again, about 18. We think it's Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. We're not 100% sure. Some historians argue it would be Gary of Massachusetts. But again, these are individual thoughts, not as well organized, not as well collaborated as the Federalist, but it sort of provides a point counterpoint. So that we sort of rid of that with that. So one of the things I like to use is we use a lot of grok for which we get a little why we're using it, but it's a great way for us to take the theories of the 18th century, make them easily digestible. So we have here asking him to translate chapters 18 through 19. It gives a really brief summary. So if on the screen, Dissolution of Government and the Right of Revolutions, chapters 18, 19, they go through and say, look, when the rulers violate the trust, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. Government is dissolved, power reverts to the community. People have the natural right to resist and replace the government. A revolution is justified as self-defense of natural rights. This is not an anarchy, just to return to the natural state. And so the students can see, okay, this is what you're supposed to be getting out of this. So it provides almost that free tutoring service, that free TA service, without having to spend money on those kinds of resources. And it gives them a really good way of being able to distill the essence of Locke. This is the actual text, but when the actual force is over. And so it's a whole bunch of text that's very challenging to read, right? Even for us as faculty, sometimes it takes us 2 or 3 different readings of it, but they're able to go through and sort of see where you're able to extract those core ideas. And so when you put that into the system, it comes through, it says, identifies where it's from, talks about the state of war, and then Locke's explaining the crucial difference between how a state of war exists versus the state of nature. So it allows you to easily understand that and allows the students to be able to sort of skip ahead without getting stuck by the reading and the understanding, to be able to actually, not the reading, but the reading of it and understanding those words, to actually understand the concepts. So students then able to understand the concept, okay, here we have a state of nature versus a state of war, be able to engage with that intelligently. And so it provides plain language 1 to 3. So I ran this through Grok, said please break this down in plain language. So it goes through when civil society. So it begins to say, okay, what we're talking about here is immediate physical force. Both sides are equally subject to fair laws and impartial judges. There's now an appeal available. So the student who's reading it can now get okay, this is what the core context is, without necessarily having to worry about the 18th century language. And again, you can sort of see on the screen the sort of the differences of there. Think about positive laws, innocent parties offering peace and reconciliation to make it much easier. And then the idea of there's still a state of war, being able to translate that into there. So in a few ways, they're able to take each part of that to make it more understanding to the student, so the student doesn't just give up. And what's nice about this is it's 24/7. So where students are sometimes limited when we offer tutors or when we offer faculty hours, Here, they can be able to get the additional information to finish the assignment, not necessarily stepping out of it. It's kind of an example of how we use Grok and using the Avalon project as a way to facilitate knowledge and understanding for our students. Saves us the cost of having a TA, provides us a way to stack the heavier language, and continue to interact with the program and activities. So the Federalist paper assignment I want to talk about is students use the Avalon text. For background on the topic, we do allow them to use Wikipedia. When I was a student, Wikipedia was verboten. But at this point, Wikipedia has become enough of a peer review that it becomes incredibly accurate. And so they can look up the Wikipedia page for Federalist number 55, get the background on why it was written, where it was written, what were some of the major keys. What I don't like about the Wikipedia is when they just copy and paste from that. And so I don't want them doing that, but it's enough for them to be able to get a background information from it. So what they do is they go through and be able to compare about this. So let's take Federalist number 55. For those who may not be familiar with it, Federalist 55 talks about the composition of the new legislative branch, right? How are we going to make sure representation is large enough? Brutus 4, the anti-Federalist paper, says this new government is way too big. There's going to be no representation of the people. Something just to put in mind, when we were first establishing congressional districts, there were about 30,000 people per congressional district. So if we had kept that, there would have been 3 members of Congress from Albany, given how big that city is. So just something to think about as we go through there. Currently, there's about 750,000 people per congressional district. So we have far and away exceeded that. So in a lot of ways, Brutus 4 might actually have been more accurate in 2026 than in 1787. So we asked Grok, talked about it, and so I asked them to compare it. And Grok said, "Yep, okay, Federalist number 55, we believe is by Madison, and Brutus number 4, we believe by Yates. Contribute to the ratification debate of the U.S. Constitution. Both focus intensely on the size and adequacy of representation of the proposed House of Representatives, making them a direct counterpoint exchange in one of the most heated issues." So Grok's like be able to introduce them to that. And what's cool is we tell the students to develop a table using Grok to be able to compare and contrast. So here you have the aspect under control, so the ideal size of the house. Federalist 55 says, yep, the house is going to start at 65 and go from there. Brutus number 4 says, larger, more numerous, small size enables lead capture and disconnection from the people. Risk is corruption and tyranny. The Federalists were like, this is going to be very low, right? There's going to be enough checks and balances, and we're going to be electing the best members of Congress. We're going to have public virtue, so there won't be any corruption. There won't be any bad things going on with Congress. One can always hope. Then high, like they're very concerned about this, that few reps are easier to corrupt bribe, and that they would be so far distance in this new federal city, they wouldn't be able to be contend with the issues back home. Representation on quality. So the Federalists are like, hey, we're going to have good quality members. We won't have a lot of them. We're going to have really good ones. The anti-Federalists are like, no, we need a large group of people. We have knowledge and confidence that the reps actually mirror the interests of the local people. Adaptability, thinking about the growth via the census. Their concern was that the anti-Federalists were concerned that having too small of a Congress would lead to an elitism situation and would be out of touch with the common person. View of human nature. So again, get back to John Locke, trusting in virtue and institutional checks to restrain ambition. Whereas the anti-Federalists, very much like Thomas Hobbes, is saying, no, this assumes ambition design will exploit small bodies. And so overall stance of the Constitution, the Federalists are like, yes, absolutely, it's workable and balanced. And the anti-Federalists are like, no, this would never work. And so the students are able to go through and be able to see that. And so the educational goal of being able to differ between Federalist 55 and Brutus number 4 for the anti-Federalist papers has been achieved. So this makes it much more easy to distill. They can go back and see the different sections. Does everyone hopefully following with that? So it goes through and you ask them for the key points, and they go through and give the areas, right? And so there's no precise ideal number of representations, and they talked about the state legislature varying rapidly, and the concerns the Federalists had, right? Then you ask them to compare the anti-Federalists, and be able to go through and say what those positions are. So it allows them to be able to make those positions pretty well. Now that we've sort of established here is what the governing documents look like, here are the different perspectives on this, they can actually take it to the next level and think about modern day issues. Those of you who've been following the Supreme Court, and I actually just changed this today to update current issues. Nicole Malatakis, she's from New York's 11th district, which is mainly Richmond County, Staten Island. The state legislature is looking to redraw it to add some more Democrats in the district, to swing it from being a Republican-held district to be a Democratic-held district. And so she sued, and the Supreme Court sided with her last night. Pretty much along political orientation. And so asking Grok a simple question, hello, Grok, can you tell me how Malatakis' attempts to keep a congressional district lines the same compared to Federalist 55? And so the computer is able to go through and say, yep, it appears that her defense of the district lines aligns with Madison's broader principles in the Federalist 55, favoring practical non-excessive representation. And so using this, they're able to take a current event issue, align it nicely with a current event issue. And so again, by resisting to redraw driven by demographic tweaks, she effectively sought to maintain a district configuration. And basically saying, yep, Malatakis echoes Madison's view that representation should be sufficient for knowledge and sympathy without being so fragmented to invite the mob bosses, and mob-like passions. And so this kind of connection here where the students are able to take this 18th century idea and apply it to the events of March 2nd, 2026. Another example is obviously on Saturday, there was a military attack against Iran. And, let's keep everyone in the thoughts and prayers. But asking Grok, hey, Grok, it's been a hectic couple of days of military strikes in Iran. What you can tell me how the U.S. attacking Iran would be viewed compared to Federalist 69? Federalist 69 was written by Hamilton, again, looking at the war powers of government. And Grok was able to give this answer. So the ongoing U.S. military strikes in Iran, launched jointly with Israel, so it gives a background for the students. So the students are able to get an idea, here's what's going on. And then be able to get that Federalist number 69, authored by Alexander Hamilton, defends the proposed constitution's allocation of executive powers. And so to be able to give this idea of, okay, here's how things work, this is how this ties in there. Without the ability to declare war, raise regular force, initiate hostilities, unilaterally. Such powers are reserved for Congress to prevent monarchical overreach and ensure deliberative representative decision makings on matters of war. And so students are able to go through and be able to say, okay, if Hamilton was writing today, Hamilton would have this view on the president's decision to fire weapons into the country. Then it goes through and it gives this idea that U.S. strikes in Iran could be viewed as diverging from the strict limits that Hamilton had outlined. Presidential military initiative is confined to immediate self-defense rather than offensive preemptive campaigns, and be able to give this area here. And Grok again goes through and says, echoing the very kingly powers Hamilton sought to avoid. And he gives a counter effect. The defenders may align with Hamilton's allowance for repealing threats, interpreting modern pre-exemption as an extension of defensive command. And so no direct invocation of Federalist 69 appears in public statements from Trump and Congress. Usually politicians don't say, well, this is what the Federalist Papers said, 242 years ago. But it gives the idea of this is how these things go. And so this provides a really powerful tool for us to be able to use, for students to be able to put together concepts and thoughts and be able to work with that. One question we do get from some people is, does it have to be Rock? No, it doesn't. We generally find that it's better with history and gives you some better citations. So if we go back up to the, I'm sorry, I didn't paste over, but Grok's answers on the military actually does give you where they got the information from. And so with our librarian, we've done a lot of is this a good source, is this a bad source? And to be able to allow the students to be able to actually probe that. I don't mandate the use of Grok in the classroom. Students are free to use an AI of their choice. It is interesting how sometimes the AIs diverge. So AI and Claude seem very different from one another. ChatGPT is interesting, but I find it's not as thorough as Grok. So it gives people kind of those variances. So the key concept, I want people to get stuck up on always using Grok. I want to get people the idea that using these open access resources like the Avalon Project and combining them with Grok or a similar AI provides students with a tutoring service, ability to dissect very complicated ideas and concepts. So that's my presentation, and I have left plenty of time for questions. But that's kind of the cool thing we're doing. We're using 18th century theory with a website developed in the 1990s with 2026 artificial intelligence, and in a way helping to enable and empower our students to be able to understand these concepts better. I would also note I don't teach political science majors. We don't have a major yet at SUNY Delhi for political science, though I keep asking for one. But it does allow non-majors to be really able to interact with us and to be able to understand that. And so this is the presentation I use with the Federalist Papers. We do similar things with State of the Union addresses when we get to the presidency and asking the artificial intelligence to be able to distill the key points of these hour to 2 hour speeches and what those major policy points were as well. So, with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and open up if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Peter. You actually answered my question, which was um, I was going to ask if you've ever done any comparison with other AI tools to see what information is given to students, but you sort of addressed that in saying that you don't just require Grok. I mean, students can use any sort of AI tool, and
Yeah.
sometimes results differ.
No, and that's um, particularly with current events, I get very nervous because so much of the artificial intelligence going out there and seeing what's on the internet. As we know, not the internet is one of my favorite quotes is Abraham Lincoln said, 90% of the stuff on the internet is just made up, right? But there's a lot of fake information out there. And Claude and Grok have slightly different takes on it. I do find that Grok has a little more historical evidence, but Claude is also just as fine as a source. The one thing that's kind of interesting is occasionally I get a student and they seem really off base on what they wrote, and usually it's like a Grammarly generative text because with Grammarly it's trying to get you to the words and stuff like that. It doesn't necessarily have the same historical sort of ability to use that. One thing I have also just as a quick aside, I noticed with Grok really wants you to be able to sign into it, and so you might get one or two free questions off of Grok, but after that they want you to sign up for it. And there is a point where I do check the students' work, and so I hit a point where I was checking the students' inputs, and I actually hit my Grok limit. And they're like, "Oh, you can upgrade to a more expensive Grok." And I'm like, "No, I'm not there yet." I also want to make sure that I am being acknowledged that there is a huge environmental cost to this, and some of the energy that we're using to power this does have a negative impact on the environment.
That is important consideration. I really appreciated the how you leveraged the Federalist Papers in this case, but in any case that you could do this with, you would give it the source material, right? The original context and compare it to today's current events. So I think that that is something that can translate, right, to other disciplines and even in the historical context to other assignments.
Yeah, no, and it's really great to be able to do that. And again, depending on which class, this is for American government.
Mhm.
But when we do for economics, we also teach some economic theory, and it comes in really useful when we're reading like Das Kapital or reading Adam Smith or doing Milton Friedman to be able to make that more accessible.
It's also just good to have an awareness of something like the Avalon Project, that it's out there to be able to access those kinds of documents.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I taught at the University of District of Columbia for a year, and the University of District of Columbia is the nation's only urban HBCU. And it was the first time I really encountered concerns about textbook costs. And so my uh, dean at the time said, "Well, you had to bring your textbooks for approval." And I've never had that done. And so we sat down. She's like, "Okay, you need to cut your textbook cost by $40." It was coming in like 160, and the maximum I could charge for books was 120. And so it was a really much a financial driven need because the students could not afford to spend more than X amount of dollars on books. And so it really started pushing me into the OER universe. And here at SUNY Delhi, our librarian, Carrie Fisher, has done a great job making sure that we have accessible resources. And our provost, Dr. Brower, has done a really good job of sort of how do we find ways of making it cheaper, more affordable for students? Because for a lot of our students, the first generation, they come from limited means, and it's just so expensive to get textbooks.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so much is available, right, online. So you may have to kind of source from several different sites to get all of the kind of documents you're going to be sharing in your semester, but you can find them for the most part. And our SUNY OER services has a whole catalog of OER textbooks available, courseware, modules, that kind of thing that are openly available. So I want to make sure folks know about that as well.
Sounds good.
All right,
Susan,
Susan, any
do you have any
questions?
questions?
Do what? I didn't.
Just wondering if you had any questions before we wrap here.
I don't. Thank you.
Of course. All right, well, I'm going to grab a link so that folks know where they can get our recordings. Oops, there we go. So I'll put this in the chat, but our website, for those who can't see the chat, is online.suny.edu/OEW. Sessions are posted there for the week, and recordings will be posted there as well. So again,
The only
Peter, I
question I
really
have,
appreciate your time.
I teach math, and I was wondering if Grok would be good for tutoring them in math.
So that's interesting, right? Susan,
Uh,
I think that there are a lot of applications for Grok or any other AI tool
uh,
when you think about teaching in other subjects. Yeah, so I think that's a good perspective.
yeah.
Yeah. So something else you can do with Grok too is we only have so many problem sets to give, particularly in economics, but you can ask
Sure.
Grok to, can you give me 10 practice questions testing
Sure.
elasticity?
Yeah, but I teach math. I teach like algebra and stuff like that, college algebra, developmental math, stuff like that, not economic problems.
Yeah. But
Yep,
Grok,
but you could adapt it for your context. Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
if you do, and particularly, well, part of this is also teaching students how to use the AI. Because what we
right.
don't want to do is we don't want to have students say, okay, solve for X. But if you can say,
That's what's going to happen if we let them use AI, and that's what I think they do that anyway. But
yeah, but what you do is you train them. If you say, hi Grok, can you explain how to solve this problem step by step? It again provides that kind of free tutoring service,
uh,
which and college students being college students, they can sometimes do things at the last minute. So if they're doing their homework at 2 o'clock in the morning, they can get that kind of live tutoring.
okay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So using the AI to help explain the process as opposed to what is the answer.
Yeah. And now you get them to do that because they're going to be too tempted to just say, "What is the answer?"
Yeah.
Of course. It's also something that you can require that they bring in, what the AI suggested versus how they might go about, solving the problem. Because there are, in some cases, more than one way to get to it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.